Welcome back to Careers Explained. Today we're talking with Matt Petit about his career path and role as a Foreign Service officer and as the Director for African Affairs at the National Security Council. He joined the Foreign Service in 2008 and has worked as a Vice Consul in India, a desk officer in Somalia and Eritrea, and as the Deputy Chief of Political and Economic Affairs at the U.S. Embassy in Zambia. Matt speaks Persian, Spanish, and some Russian, Armenian, Tamil, German, and French. Can you start by describing what made you interested in being a Foreign Service officer?
I first became interested in joining the Foreign Service at Davidson. I began taking a few classes in foreign affairs, political science, my sophomore year. I spoke at length and in depth with some of the Davidson professors about careers in foreign policy to get their takes on which way I could go: grad school, Peace Corps, Foreign Service, intelligence, military, etc. But what really galvanized my interest was my summer during the Davidson and Washington program in 2006. I took an internship with the Association for Diplomatic Studies and Training, which is a part of the State Department's Foreign Service Institute that records oral histories of former diplomats and other US officials who've served overseas. Not only does it record their oral histories, it edits them, puts out transcripts, provides these to colleges across the country. It also serves kind of as a publishing house for memoirs and other stories that former diplomats tell. While I was there, I got to meet and interact with former hostages during the Iran hostage crisis, with the first Black American ambassador, who was then the record-holding 8-time ambassador all over the world. Absolutely incredible. With our ambassador in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, who was there during the embassy bombing in 1998, and really saw a broad cross-section of the Foreign Service and how normal Americans come to the job, face tremendous obstacles, and ideally build their team, grow their own career in a way that supports their families, their countries, and our morals, values, and interests overseas.
That sounds like an incredible summer experience, which then translated into a lifelong experience. And once you were interested in the role from that one internship, what were the next steps to become a Foreign Service officer after graduation?
Well, I actually started before graduation, and it's something that any Davidson student can take on. The Foreign Service officer test is open to anybody who's over 18 years old. You don't have to have a college education. You don't have to have finished your degree. You don't have to have any specific qualifications other than you passed the test. So I applied for the first part of the test in the summer between my junior and senior year, and then took the written examination at UNC Charlotte, passed that, was invited to an oral assessment in Washington. I actually had to take an exam at Davidson, a final at Davidson, get on a plane. I was writing one of my final papers. The next day, I took my oral assessment, flew down, finished that paper, then took an exam the next day. It was not the least stressful time of my life.
That sounds like the first test of many in the role. You were practicing for handling obstacles, starting with jam-packing in tests your senior year.
Well, and what's interesting is that a number of the real-world scenarios that I described some of these seasoned former and retired diplomats experiencing formed the basis for a number of the questions in the written and oral assessments for the Foreign Service officer test. And what I tell a lot of people who take the test is they're not expecting you to get it right, because ultimately there's no right answer to some of these hypothetical situations. What they're doing is seeing how you react to pressure, seeing how you come up with a cogent and workable thought process and solution in a way that doesn't get you too flustered. Obviously, people are nervous when you're going into these exams 20, 21, 22 years old. and there's like retired generals, like a former manager for the Beastie Boys, these incredibly credentialed and qualified people taking the test with you. You think, what am I? Who am I? But what I tell students and others who take the exam is, go for it. You don't know what you bring to the table, and you're not necessarily the best judge of your own qualifications. There are others who might see things in you, see a potential for the future that could help build a career over a span of 20, 30 years. They're specifically trained to look for that. Mm-hmm. And I tell people, go in with some confidence. At that point in your life, you're figuring out who you are. You know that you want to devote your life to service. Emphasize that you're looking for opportunities to serve your country, to develop our social compact, to serve people overseas. Try to find those commonalities and intersection of interests where in diplomacy we can all move forward together. And then, also find a way to be a bit adventurous, even though the jobs can be tough and these questions can be tough as well. Go into with the confidence that maybe not this time, maybe not the next time, maybe the time beyond that, you're going to pass the test at some point and have a great adventurous career. Now, foreign service, state foreign service is not the only foreign service. It's not the only way to get involved in foreign affairs, but it is a good way to do it. And it is an opportunity that offers you a broad slate of options to get involved. I work on political issues primarily, but you can work on economic, management, consular, so visas and American citizen services, and public diplomacy. That's just for generalists as well. We also have a specialist category for which you do have to have some specific qualifications. So information technology, medical specialists, we have some general services, so management specialists, we have security specialists as well. So there's a broad array of things that you can do in the foreign service. You can also work at the State Department domestically as a civil servant on an even broader array of issues.
What made you choose out of all of those different ways to be involved in service to be on the political aspect?
As many of my colleagues will readily agree, I like talking. I like talking to people. I like building those connections one-on-one, being authentic to somebody. I think there's a misconception that diplomacy is the art of dissembling or of lying to somebody such that they don't think that they're being lied to and they come away happy from a conversation. It's not that at all. It's also not just telling people what they want to hear. It's not that either. Diplomacy and the political side of it specifically, I think when done well, is trying to find some commonality with the person or people you're talking to, speaking to them honestly, even if that means being humble. Ideally, it means being humble, admitting some fault on your own, delivering hard messages that they might not want to hear, accepting hard messages that you don't want to hear. Because the core of it is building trust, person by person, tour by tour, country by country. So why I wanted to pursue the political track is because I thought maybe I have something to offer there. Maybe I have quite a lot to learn from others who've pursued the track. And, hopefully as somebody who's coming in with a good moral grounding from the Davidson education, who's coming in young, I entered at 22, maybe I can inject a little bit of energy, a different perspective. Now, that being said, I think this is getting maybe ahead of myself. I'm coming from a privileged background. I'm a straight cishet white man. Coming to the Foreign Service, a lot of people look like me and come from my background. And what I have realized and I'm trying to practice is that even though I think I have a lot to offer, there are many times at which I have to step aside. And when it's time for others to build their skills, display these skills, and to take on leadership roles. So all that is to say, I decided to be a political officer because I like the lowercase p politics of it, meaning focusing on the people side of things.
Mm-hmm. And so then what would you describe your role specifically as a Foreign Service officer? What do you do more specifically?
One of the nice things about a foreign service career is that you kind of get to reinvent yourself every 2 or 3 years. You will start out usually doing a consular tour, so doing thousands and thousands of visas. I did 36,000 visa interviews, or providing citizen services for Americans in various states of need. But then the next assignment, you're going to work overseas, building these connections with people that we would call contacts, so that we can basically, kind of like a journalist, figure out what's going on in a country, do a little bit of investigative work, make connections, analyze it, and then with your team in the embassy or consulate, send the best advice back to Washington so that they can hopefully use it to compare and contrast against other things that they're receiving from other agencies and make the best policy decision. 2 years, 3 years later, you could be back in Washington being one of those people on a country desk, or working on human rights, or on counterterrorism, or global criminal justice, and receiving those reports, talking to people in Washington and advising up your chain to principals so that they can make those decisions. And then, 2, 3 years later, you go out, you get language training, you get paid to learn a language. It's incredible. You could do another consular assignment. You could work in management within the embassy or consulate, basically making it run. You could be kind of like the public relations specialist for an embassy or back in Washington, writing statements, interacting with media, going out there, speaking, doing interviews. Kind of scary for me, quite frankly. But depending on what you want, what's right for you and what's right for your family, it can be one thing in one kind of set of countries or continental focus. It can be many things. You can be on 5 different continents in 10 years. You can work on 5 different types of jobs in 10 to 12 years. So there really is a lot of variety within the career. And even though you're doing kind of the same sort of thing with some variation in that 2-year period, the clock kind of starts over when you go to your next job. Of course, you're bringing transferable skills. The interpersonal skills that you develop in one job are certainly going to serve you well in the next one. You talk to 36,000 people. Hopefully you're good at dealing with stress and unfortunately delivering hard messages sometimes. So that can be helpful when you're working on a country desk, or when you're advising somebody very senior and you have to work long hours, or when you're overseas building those connections and writing those cables, the antiquated word that we use for reports.
And what determines, you mentioned it's 2 to 3 years, what determines when you leave and what your next assignment is in terms of both location and role?
Your first 2 assignments are usually 2 years each. They can be shorter if you're going to an extreme hardship post, think Iraq.
Yeah.
Usually you're not going to do that on your first 2 assignments, but there can be some variation there. You don't have a lot of control over where you go in your first 2 assignments. You're basically deemed worldwide available. So the department says, based on your language skills, if you come in with a very high demand language like Mandarin or Hindi or Persian, you're probably going to go to a post where you would be utilizing that language. After those first 2 assignments, it's really up to you and what's available. About a year before you leave a post, after those first 2 tours, you start looking around based on a list of things that are available on your timeline, i.e. your ETA for leaving the post a year later, on which language skills you have, on your own experience, and then you kind of do a normal job interview process that we call bidding. You say, here's why I think I'm the best candidate for this position. You do that to, 3, 5, 10, however many positions across the board. They then look at you against other candidates, and then the bureau, in this case, regional bureau, so African affairs for most of my career, will say, well, we think this person would be best over here. This person was a close second, but we think they'd be really good in this job. And they said that job would be something that would suit them. So they kind of play a bit of a matching game. Then at that point, you're assigned a little bit under a year out before going. If you have language, it's a little longer. After you finish your assignment, you go into language training, or you go directly to that next assignment. I've had 2 opportunities to learn languages, Tamil for my first assignment in South India, and then Persian for my assignment as an Iran watcher in Armenia. You can do more languages, you can do fewer languages, you have to do at least one. Mm-hmm. You can focus on a continental area, you can focus on something functional, so on like narcotics and law enforcement, counterterrorism, human rights, and follow different paths as long as those jobs are available. It can be a bit of a tough balance. And when you're traveling with a family, oftentimes you have to balance school schedules, your spouse or partner's work potential, their schedules. It can be stressful, but a lot of times things do lock into place. The one bit of advice that I do give people in the Foreign Service and joining the Foreign Service is find out what's important to you. If you have ambition to move up really fast, that's fine. Make sure that you take care of yourself. Understand what mental health resources are out there for you. Take rest time. Don't go really hard and really long hours constantly. If you want to just enjoy a long career, you don't really care about moving up, that's great. Find places that you enjoy going to and work that you value and helps you get up in the morning. If you want to go to a place where, like me, your spouse is working, find places that have jobs where your spouse is going to be able to have a fulfilling and fulfilled career experience themselves.
And what in between assignments, you might learn a language. You mentioned your 2. What's the training like for that language requirement? And also more broadly, training for different assignments, what does it look like?
A lot of it's on the job. I, as I said, started at 22. I didn't really know a lot. I had Davidson behind me, and I mentioned in my interviews, having a leadership role in the Davidson College Symphony Orchestra, the Jazz Ensemble, or at the Armenian Society. These are not things that are going to be hugely beneficial to me overseas, but are experiences that I could call back on, lessons that I learned. When you're on the job, you learn further lessons, and this is where the humility comes in. You have to be humble enough to learn from people who have been in the career longer, have a broader perspective on things, but also hungry and intolerant enough of maybe poor management and things that might have been accepted before, like yelling or abuse, things that happen in a lot of workplaces and unfortunately are still present in our workplace too. So, language training is a great opportunity to dig into something, to be hyper-focused 7 hours a day, very small classes on language. Other opportunities for training are somewhat limited. If you are a specialist, you have more opportunities. For a generalist, you can take courses here and there, but for the most part, it will be you learning in the field, on the job, by experience. And, you're going to make some mistakes. You have to take care that those mistakes aren't too big, but when you do make mistakes, admit it, apologize, learn from them, and hopefully do better, and then impart those lessons on to others who come behind you.
And learning from those who've been in the role previously and those around you, what does your team look like? And if it varies, can you give sort of the range of the teams that you've worked on?
Sure. Overseas, you will be in either an embassy or a consulate, which is in a non-capital city and reports up to the embassy in the capital. At an embassy, at the top is ideally the ambassador. Below him or her is going to be the deputy chief of mission. And then below him or her will be the country team, which is composed of people who manage political sections, management sections, security, sometimes other agencies like the Department of Defense will be at the post and have representatives. And then below those heads of sections will be, when you start, you're working with colleagues from those different sections. You have a lot of interplay with them. You have to clear things with them. You have to have conversations with them. You work on joint products. And then beyond that, your community is also the local staff who are supporting the embassy. And this is maybe 5 or 6 times the numbers of Americans who are assigned to an embassy at a given time. So that's your internal community. Your external community is all of the people in the country that you're serving with. And you have to understand, when you're overseas, you are always on. You are always a diplomat, always representing the United States. And there's nothing that you do that can be excused as being on your personal time. Now, being back here in Washington, I can tell you, look, I'm speaking to you in my personal capacity, not representing the US government. When I'm overseas, though, that becomes very, very restricted. So you have to be careful on how you portray yourself and how you interact with the broader community, even after working hours. When you're in Washington, things look a little different. You will usually be in the main headquarters, Department of State, sometimes in one of the annexes around the Washington area, a couple of them across the US. And there is a bureaucracy, we're bureaucrats. So there will usually be people who are managing you, people managing them, up to and including, some of the highest ranking officials, which would be our assistant secretary, who manages everything in a region or in a kind of functional area. In ours, the assistant secretary manages hundreds of people covering African affairs. Above them will be undersecretaries. This is where it gets very technical and bureaucratic, reporting to one of 2 deputy secretaries, and then eventually the Secretary of State himself in this case. The secretary is part of another team, another layer of cabinet officials who all report to the president. So at a given basis, you're 10 layers down below that. You're, again, in Washington, working with people laterally, people who are all around you, who represent different country issues or different topics, and you coordinate with them to hopefully make the best policy. Again, informed by some of the people in the external community and then the communications that you're getting from your embassies overseas. So it's a huge network of information, relationships, activities that involves a lot of collaboration, a lot of conversations, some difficult, but if you're going to make the best policy, it can't be myopic. It can't be focused on one person. It has to be broad-based, taking into account as many opinions and as much expertise as possible. This is why I said earlier, it's important for somebody, even though they might consider themselves to be an expert, to step aside, step back, and say, well, people from different backgrounds who come to this job with different opinions, different experiences, what do you think? If you disagree with this policy, tell me why. I'm not going to take it personally. Tell me why you disagree with this. And you'll either convince me, I'll convince you, we'll come to a compromise, and then let's elevate that up to the next level, tell them why. And then if we as a team disagree with that level up, let's make the best argument, make the case. Sometimes we'll prevail, sometimes we won't. Sometimes there are ways that we can express our dissent in other forms. We have a dissent channel at the Department of State. And it's something that we're encouraged at least to take advantage of. So in any of those contexts, you're going to be part of a team of people who have different experiences, different backgrounds, different perspectives and viewpoints. And it will be incumbent on you as a diplomat to be a diplomat, not just to the people of the country you're assigned to, but internal to your community.
Really a social job with open-mindedness to dialogue with kind of everyone around you, all those different stakeholders. And going back to if
it's going right, yes.
Yeah. And going back to the 10 layers down point about how many people there are vertically, what are the opportunities for moving up? You mentioned some people can prioritize fast tracking, others can take it. How does someone move up?
You will be, when you come in as an entry-level officer, you will be automatically promoted a couple of times to a certain rank. And then you have to pass a first hurdle called tenure. Basically, the department's saying you're no longer a provisional employee. We think that you will have a long and successful career, just like in academia, you're tenured. So stamp of approval, you can advance further. After that, you are up for competitive promotions. So you will do a yearly evaluation, and based on a certain number of those, and after 3 years, depending on the ranking that you're at, you'll be evaluated, and a panel will determine if you're ready to go up to the next level. It really depends on not just your performance, but how many people are at each rank in the department at a given time. So if a ton of people went in before you, like there was a big hiring surge, and then you came in right on the tail end of that, you might not be promoted as fast. Yeah. But if you come in at a time where it's right after a hiring freeze, you might get promoted a little bit faster than average. How you take assignments can affect your promotion, can affect how you move up and through the system. Some people like to take more challenging assignments and think that that moves them up more quickly. Some people focus on often neglected parts of the world or neglected issues, and that can move them up more quickly as well. For example, it is probably a little bit harder to move up because there are so many people working in European, Eurasian affairs right now than it is in Africa. There aren't as many people working in Africa, so you can distinguish yourself a little bit more widely and more quickly depending on how you perform.
And then what are your typical roles, and can you show that in an example, because I'm sure it varies based on your assignment, of some of the assignments that you've done, tasks that you've done?
In many cases, my role is building out my group of contacts. So people that I know and can call on to speak to a specific issue, do some research, or understand an event that happened in a country. But some of the things that I enjoy most is going out and just meeting random people and displaying a different part of American culture, even the hard parts, maybe even especially the hard parts. So I like to talk to student groups about American history. I was a music major at Davidson. I play trombone. I'm not a very good jazz trombonist, but I like to talk about the intersection between Black American history, jazz, civil rights movement, and kind of introduce that struggle, how music developed, how some of the music that they're listening to today and the cultural trends that they're experiencing today found their origin or are accelerated in the early middle part of the 20th century in the United States. A lot of people find that very interesting, and it builds that connection in their brain that, oh, this music that I heard the other day actually came from America, and that music in America actually came from this very painful part of American history, which is the transatlantic slave trade, which then goes back to, parts of West and Southern Africa. When I was serving in Zambia, we talked a bit about that. I said, there are some cuisines that you enjoy here in Zambia that were imported into the Americas during the period of enslavement, and then have become the basis for a lot of soul food in the United States. Pair that with music and jazz and the history of development of different art forms in American history, and you can really build out a connection with all sorts of different people, particularly young people. So one of the ways I did this was in India. I participated in a jazz jam session with the band for A.R. Rahman, who was the musician and composer behind Slumdog Millionaire. His band was based in the city that I was assigned to. He had just come in for a visa. We, our public diplomacy section made some connections with him. And we were like, let's get together and do something that talks about American culture, talks about Indian culture. Slumdog Millionaire was just this big phenomenon a year ago. So I got to jam with this group of musicians who were much better than me. And then out of the audience comes this young trumpet player. He just brought his trumpet. He was, part of the school that we had been hosted at and been using the stage. And he was playing with us. And then this woman comes in and she says, I don't know jazz very well. I'm a Carnatic, so traditional South Indian singer. Can I just sing with you and you all can do something in the background? So she starts singing based on this raga, which is kind of like a jazz scale, something that you would be improvising off of. And the rest of us were improvising in a different way based on a combination of American and South Indian art forms. And it created this entirely new thing. it was just this euphoric moment that crystallized and hyper-focused all the things that I wanted to do and be as a diplomat at that point. I've tried to recapture that in the years past, but that's something that I keep going back to as a great example of how you can, even when I was doing visas, go from the visa line at night, call back something that has this deep history, bring it to something that also has a history, hundreds, even thousands of years of history, create something new that then other people can enjoy.
Bringing together, as you said originally, the commonalities between the cultures to really form those connections.
And differences. And enjoying, yeah.
And you talk about being always on when you're abroad. What are the hours technically, even if off the clock, what does the day look like, including kind of your working hours?
Well, working in DC is usually much worse for work hours.
Interesting. Okay.
It varies. When you're in your consular tour, when you're working on visas, it's very 9 to 5, or 8 to 5, something like that. You show up on the line. You have a certain period of time when you're doing interviews. You have lunch. You have a certain period of time when you're processing some of the security or fraud prevention or other things that you would be doing on visa cases. Then it's 5 o'clock and you go home. When you're a political officer, so working with these contacts and working with other diplomatic missions, sometimes that means that throughout the day you will show up, you have some section meetings, you have a country team meeting, you work on a cable draft that you had been developing for the past few days, you go out, meet new contacts, get updated information, and then the day ends ostensibly around 5, 6 p.m., but then you go to a reception and you catch up with other members of the diplomatic corps or civil society or religious leaders, people who you'd known before, make new connections, get all the business cards, give all the business cards, do a little bit of work, get updates from kind of the broad spate of people who are there, so you can build new cables for the next day that you write and the next types of project. You have different projects going on. You have maybe 5, 6 cables in your head that you are collecting information based on, and then you're comparing, contrasting notes based on people that you talk to. In Washington, my day here, so I'm on National Security Council, the White House, is a little bit different than it is at State Department. I'm a firm believer of leaving when my job is done. So when I'm at State, if it is 5 p.m. and I'm done and my team is done, I'm gone. I'm telling them, you go too. Even in crisis times where you have to stay late, sometimes you work on the weekends. When I was managing a small team on the Sudan desk, I said, I'm taking this on, or we're going to rotate so that each and every one of us can have a time where we can recharge and not constantly be on. One of us can take this day, the next day you take this one, the next day you take this one, and put an out of office message that says, go to this person during these off hours because I'm getting my much needed rest. That is vital for people to come back to the office, recharge, and to connect with their families and friends and have some time to be off. At NSC, it's a little bit more difficult. You have people who are reporting directly to the president asking you for things. And, they work until 10, 11 p.m. So I try as hard as I can to get out of there at a reasonable hour, but it can be later in the day, unfortunately. But again, that's where you have to draw the line. If you can leave and it is 6 p.m., go. That's what I do. If I have to stay, I will tell my wife, I'm sorry, there's something very, very pressing that I have to take on. Then I have to stay at 8, 9 p.m. at times.
And she knew what she was signing up for as you got into the role. You do what you can, but it's not always in your control.
Yeah, that doesn't make it better or more fun. No. But it's also another thing that I advise people is when you have a high stress, high demand job, maybe don't make your next job something like that. You owe it to yourself to take a little bit of a breather, maybe do something that's more like 8 or 9 to 5. You need to do it if you have a family for sure. Your kids at 6 years old, like my daughter, are going to remember when you weren't there. But the people you worked with are not really going to remember when you stayed until 8 or 9 at night. So what's really important is your life, it makes you a better worker, but that is by far a secondary aspect of it. You need to be a better person, as good as you can.
And when you talk about kind of your next assignment should be something different, how long do people typically stay in this role? Are you usually a diplomat for life and it might vary Washington to another assignment, or do people leave after 5 years?
Some do. Some come in to do something different. It's their second or third careers. Some come in and find, this isn't really for me. Some people do stay in for 30, 40 years. It really depends. You're going to hear me say this a lot.
Yeah.
For me, I think at a macro level, I will stay in this job as long as it's, number one, good for my family. If it gets to the point where it's too much stress on them, not just my wife and daughter, but also, my parents, her parents, our siblings, then it's not going to be worth it, because that's not a sacrifice I'm going to make. If it is no longer fitting your moral values, then I think you need to take a serious step back and think, maybe it's time for me to go. Mm-hmm. If there are other opportunities to serve, you can definitely do those too. Even within the career, though, you can take details. Okay. For example, I'm at the White House now. I started last April. That meant that I moved out of my assigned job on the Sudan desk into this position kind of all of a sudden for a little bit over a year. You can string together a bunch of those different details, work in different agencies. You can even work for a different government as a transatlantic diplomatic fellow, and can have kind of this diverse set of experiences under the broad arc of a 20, 30-year diplomatic career. Or you can go to grad school on the government's dime. There's opportunities to study at Princeton or Harvard or Yale, National Defense University, War College, other service institutions, to take a year off, do research. You can take sabbaticals. You can be a diplomat in residence. I think that you have one in Duke or UNC that covers North Carolina and the region. You could even work at the National Museum of Diplomacy. So it's not even just one thing, and it is kind of up to you what that thing, the variety of things, looks like.
Lots of options there for type of role, location, length. You can really diversify depending on the person. And finally, what advice do you have, both general career advice and then specifically for someone who wants to follow your career into service, foreign service?
When young people in particular come to me and talk about the Foreign Service officer test, they come with the same nervousness and fears and anxiety that I did coming to it. Who am I, a recent graduate, even in college, 21, 22 years old, against all of these other incredible people? And what I tell them is, you are you have unique experiences, you have unique potential. Speak to that, and I think that you have a good shot of getting it. Maybe not this time, maybe the next time, maybe not that time, maybe the other time. Don't consider the Foreign Service as the be-all, end-all. There are other things that you can do. If you are, dead set that you want to work for the U.S. government, certainly there are options to do that domestically. You can even work for a USAID Foreign Service. Department of Commerce has a Foreign Service. Agriculture Service has a Foreign Service. There are intelligence agencies that you could consider working at. You could take some time to work at the Peace Corps, go to graduate school, and then take Foreign Service exam. But in the end, be yourself, find out who you are, and then when you do enter that career, whether it's with state or another agency or anywhere else, you will learn things, but have that core morality, that core understanding of who you are, that will help you weather the inevitable stress, variation, and sacrifice, but also help you be a good advocate for yourself, for that morality, for our country. So don't be discouraged, is what I tell a lot of young people. Be flexible, but don't break. Be confident, but don't be arrogant. be humble, but don't be afraid to deliver tough messages. It's always a balance. And I think all of us are trying to find that balance within ourselves. If we can, I think we can be very effective advocates for our country and be able to speak about all of the great things that we know about the United States and all of the things that we're still working on.
Well, thank you for speaking about those insights of your experience and what foreign service is to hopefully interest others in following your path.
I'm always open to talk to people individually. If anybody wants to find me on LinkedIn, I'm happy to do that and impart some of these lessons in a tailored manner.
Awesome. Thank you so much.